Oh, there he is. Great. Welcome. Yeah, go on up. You should.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thanks.
Our session this afternoon is about modernization of defense systems, everybody's favorite goal, but as we know, difficult to achieve in practice. Our speaker is somebody who has had deep experience both in sketching the goal and trying to achieve it. Frank Kendall, Secretary of the Air Force, West Point grad, served 11 years on active duty, served in a number of senior Pentagon positions, including 5 years as Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics. As Secretary of the Air Force, he is also overseeing the Space Force. I asked Secretary Kendall if he could tell me something about himself that's not in his bio. And he said, long pause, and he said, well, when I was a young man, I set out to sail single-handedly from the Virgin Islands to North Carolina. And a storm came up, and the self-steering system on my single-handed vessel broke. And if you want to know the end of that story, you're going to ask Secretary Kendall afterwards, but it's a great story.
I'm here.
So, Mr. Secretary, we're going to talk about modernization and your agenda for it. But I want to begin by asking about Ukraine and about deterrence in that war. A number of senior Pentagon officials have said privately that they think this moment is more dangerous for the United States and the world than any since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And I want to ask you if you agree with that. And as Secretary of the Air Force, you're in charge of two legs of the triad. So I want to ask, what are you doing as you frame the budget for the next fiscal year and beyond to strengthen deterrence in this period of unusual danger?
Yeah, I don't think I'd agree that it's as dangerous a time as the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're not on the brink of a potential nuclear conflict. But we do have to sustain the triad. We do have to modernize, recapitalize, really, our strategic triad. And all the programs to do that are underway. I am concerned about achieving schedule because the existing systems are aging out over time, and we need to be sure we can replace them in time. But that's a very, very high priority for the administration. All those programs are going to be fully funded and stay that way, and we're going to try to execute as the schedule as it's currently exists.
So in terms of specific spending, there'll be some in the next budget and more coming?
Yeah, our plans for the triad are pretty well laid out. I think we've been pretty clear about that. And we're going to make adjustments as we have to hold schedule as best we can.
So turning to modernization, you listed some months ago a set of 7 operational imperatives, as you put it, to drive modernization. Number 1, and this goes to your responsibility overseeing the Space Force, is space. And you said specifically that you wanted to define a resilient and effective space order of battle and architecture. And I want to ask you to unpack that for us, and in that answer, explain what we lack in that regard today.
Yeah, what David's referring to is what we're calling 7 operational imperatives. And they're all essentially about our conventional deterrent. And I came back into government one more time, I think, for a couple of reasons. One was concerns that I've expressed for about a dozen years now about Chinese military modernization particularly, which is quite clearly designed to defeat our ability to project power in the Western Pacific. Another is because I bring back 20 years of Cold War experience and dealing with a near peer or peer competitor who was aggressively trying to invest to defeat our ability to fight conventional warfare, among other things. So the operational imperatives are laid out to address what I see as, in some cases, current capability gaps, but certainly future or anticipated capability gaps if we don't react. The Chinese continue to modernize very aggressively. They're being very thoughtful about it, and their intention is to attack what they see as vulnerabilities in the U.S.'s ability to project power in the region. Space is the first of the seven. It's the broadest. It's about getting, it's about fulfilling the strategy in space that we actually started in the Obama administration, which recognized that we were being challenged in space in a way that we really hadn't been, even in the Cold War. China's fielding a suite of anti-satellite capabilities of various types. Russia's doing the same, basically. And it was quite clear that we cannot operate the systems that we rely upon in space with impunity as we have over the last 30-odd years. So going to more resilient architectures is part of that. We also have to protect the joint force. The Space Force has two fundamental missions. It has to provide a certain range of services to our warfighters, intelligence collection, missile warning, communications, position navigation and timing, and it also has to protect the joint force against targeting by our adversaries, potential adversaries, assets in space. And the Chinese have always thought of space, I think, as an operational domain, and they've worked to field systems that are there to threaten our terrestrial forces. So we have to deal with that as well. So the first of the operational imperatives is designed at figuring out, and they're all basically built around the premise that we have an operational problem and we need to solve it. So we need to do the analytical work, assess technology, what's available, and determine what a reasonable path is to get that technology fielded. The overarching guidance I've given to people is, in my acquisition people in particular, is I want meaningful military capability in the hands of operators as quickly as possible. That's how we should be structuring programs. We are in a race for technological superiority, more so than in space.
So I should ask how vulnerable we are in space today to the Chinese and other adversaries, and how soon that window of vulnerability, if it exists, can be closed if we proceed with the programs you're describing.
The Chinese and the Russians also, to some degree, have already fielded anti-satellite capabilities that threaten our assets in orbit. They also have systems in development where they've done some initial testing, and we can project, I think, reasonably accurately when those will arrive, and again, meaningful military capability. So we need to react quickly, and we need to move forward. We've done it with missile warning. We've put forth in this last budget that we just submitted a plan to go to a more resilient missile warning architecture. We also have a lot of good work underway from the Space Development Agency to field a more resilient communications architecture. So those two parts we've got a good start on. Other parts, not so much. So we have a lot of work to do there, and I don't think we have any time to lose. We have, I think, today a very effective deterrent. Under the doctrine of integrated deterrence, I think, together with our partners and our allies, we pose a formidable threat to any act of aggression by China, and they would certainly be misjudging us to think that our will is not there to do that. But over time, that picture is changing, and it's been changing for some time. And I don't think, quite frankly, that we have reacted as aggressively as we can or as we should to the modernization problem that we face.
General Nakasone at Cyber Command has said that in the cyber domain, there is what he called several years ago a level of persistent engagement, meaning that there's a low level of cyber conflict going on all the time in that domain. What about the space domain? Is there a low level of conflict, of challenge that we might not be aware of, but that you are, that you'd be willing to speak to?
The question is, how much can I talk about it, right? What is happening right now, I think, is in some degrees could be characterized as preparing the battlefield and building forces that could potentially be effective. So the space domain is very different. Okay, it's been characterized as the high ground, new high ground. To some degree, it is that. One way I think about space is that it's a sort of a no man's land, where both sides have observation of it, pretty unimpeded. It's also a very vulnerable place to be. And what we have relied upon for a very long time now is systems that are fairly well understood and predictable in small numbers that provide fairly lucrative or high-value targets to our adversaries. And that's what we have to move away from. We also have to move to an environment in which we, again, can protect the joint force from observation and deny our potential adversary some of the services they're getting from space. So we've got a lot of work to do there. But the first step is identifying what needs to be done and getting on the path to field it. The U.S. is a little unique in that we have divided the missions in space up between the intelligence community and the operational defense community. So I am working very closely with my counterparts in the intelligence community to ensure that we're meeting all the operational requirements that the Air Force and the Joint Force actually have. The Space Force is responsible for integrating all the services requirements in space, and we're well underway at formulating all those. Some of those we're going to try to do together in cooperation with the intelligence community. So we have a lot of work to do there. And again, there's really no time to lose.
Should I understand that within the limits of what you can say in this room, that yes, there is a low level of persistent engagement in space?
We're certainly trying to understand each other's capabilities and systems in space, actively doing that. I think both sides to some degree are working to actively field the systems that they think will be important to successful military operations in space.
So I want to skip to number 3 in your list of operational imperatives, and that is defining next generation air defense. That's fascinating in part because it involves both crewed and uncrewed fighter jets, in effect. Describe what your vision is, what that might look like, what advantages you think it will have in dealing with our adversaries in the future.
Sure, David. Several things come together there. This is next generation of air dominance. It's the family of systems, we're calling it, that is the follow-on to the F-35 and the F-22, basically. And it's a family of systems because it's not just about the next fighter plane that we might acquire. It's also not just about a manned aircraft that we might acquire, crewed aircraft. I started a program when I was the Undersecretary for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics called Next Generation Air Dominance, which was our Aerospace Innovation Initiative, which was a program to demonstrate and prove out the technologies that would be in the next generation of air dominance systems. And that program came to maturation. It was fairly successful, and it gave us one of the things that positions us to move forward with operational capabilities. But it's not just, that was for a platform, right? That was for an aircraft. That's not all there is that's needed. There's also weapons, communications, external support to what we use as our systems to control the air, and also uncrewed combat capability. One of my observations from my 4 years out of government is that the technologies for uncrewed systems have moved forward substantially. And this is through programs like the DARPA ACE program, or the Air Force's Skyberg program, or the Australian Loyal Wingman program, and others. And that those technologies have matured enough that we can now talk about committing to an uncrewed collaborative combat aircraft that would work in conjunction with a manned aircraft, a crewed aircraft. So the idea is that the crewed aircraft would control 1 to 5, let us say, more is better, uncrewed aircraft that had a suite of capabilities on them, were substantially less expensive than that crewed aircraft potentially, and they could then act as a formation, and that the play caller in that formation would be the crewed aircraft, the manned aircraft. So that's the concept. Where we are going to commit to a significant amount of resources going in that direction in our next budget submission. We spent the last year going through the analysis of all this and sorting it out and understanding what technologies are mature enough. Part of the idea is to create a platform that we can then insert technologies into and mature over time as those technologies advance. A lot of this technology associated with autonomy and with the kinds of tactical behaviors that I just talked about, and with the subsystems that might be involved, involves software. And it's going to proceed at its own pace. So what we want to do is, as we develop a platform, which will take a few years to do, at the same time we're developing the associated technologies. So we get to an entry level or an initial level of capability, and then we can continue to improve it over time. There isn't any question in my mind that this is the direction in which technology is essentially leading us. We are in a race to do this. The only question in my mind is who's going to get there first. And I intend for the U.S. Air Force to be there first.
I'm looking at General Brown as I ask this question, and I'm wondering how the two of you are doing in selling this concept to fighter pilots like General Brown, whose cockpit seats will be taken in this vision you're talking about of the future.
CQ and I'm delighted I'm here, and I think he mentioned uncrewed combat aircraft during his talk this morning. I am incredibly lucky to have an innovative, creative, far-thinking team of senior leaders at the top of the Air Force. You heard from Jay Raymond earlier this morning. You heard from CQ. They're tough acts to follow. The other member of our senior leadership team is the Undersecretary Gene Ortiz-Jones, who isn't here. But I have a great leadership team. We meet every day, first thing in the day, and talk about what we're doing, any number of a range of topics. But I am especially pleased that we are really in sync on this. I think CQ recognizes that if we're only going to buy aircraft like F-35 and F-15EX even, and an NGAD sophisticated replacement for the F-22, that we can't afford the Air Force that we have or the Air Force that we need. So we're going to have to move in this direction. And I think we're in complete sync on that.
We were talking with General Brown this morning about Top Gun Maverick. And although that's on the Navy, it does have the Air Force trailer, which is pretty spiffy. And, I was thinking, getting ready for this interview, that Top Gun Maverick set back defense modernization a decade. So you're free to comment on that, the movie or the modernization issue.
You've been raising a couple of interesting topics there. CQ and I were just at the Royal International Air Tattoo, and we both had a chance to meet Tom Cruise while we were there. I got two wonderful things that happened to me in the UK. I don't know if it's wonderful or not. I got to meet Tom Cruise, which was certainly interesting. But what was wonderful was I got a ride in a Spitfire and got to see a very earlier generation of technology firsthand, which was in its own way important at its time. I'm lost track of your question now, David. But
how Tom Cruise set back defense modernization.
No, as CQ mentioned, we got a great Air Force recruiting ad at the beginning of the movie, and people associate both of this, the Navy and the Air Force and the Marine Corps too, with fighter planes to some degree, but primarily the Air Force. And as someone who's also had the experience of landing on a carrier, I think the Air Force has a lot to offer, and for people who are interested in being pilots in the future.
I want to think that Tom Cruise is telling his pals right now, I got to meet Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall. So you have said in comments recently, talking about defense modernization, and I'm quoting, "We need to go fast, but in the right direction." So I want to ask you, what are some of the wrong directions?
I think we need to move from just doing interesting experiments or things that may be even technologically interesting to things that have a defined future and that we're confident are going to contribute to our overall capabilities. A lot of the things that CQ and Jay Raymond and I are doing are about getting technologies across the valley of death. And one of the things that
you should explain the valley of death to those in the audience who don't know what
the valley of death is. The idea that you have really interesting and technologies with high potential, which you put some funding into over on the science and technology side of the house, but you never get them into the field. You never get them built and out to operators. And the response to that, to a large extent, has been doing more on this side of the valley. Creating organizations that would look in Silicon Valley and other places, or that would do more experimentation and prototyping. From my perspective, the real problem isn't that. It isn't the availability of our access to technologies or even the recognition that they're there. It's the priorities and the resources to actually move them across. So what the operational imperatives have pointed out as much as anything is that we have a number of technologies that are ready to transition. And we just need the programs funded and prioritized to get them into the hands of our operators. So I would say that writ large, that is a result of the work we've done over the last several months in operational imperatives. And it's been encouraging to me that we've identified some things that are far enough along in some stage of early development that we can latch onto them and start to move them across. And that is really what we need to be doing. And I feel a very strong sense of urgency about this because of the threat. And I think CQ and Jay both share that. And now it's going to be about getting the resources to make that happen. You know, when people have criticized the department for not fielding technology more aggressively, I think they missed the point. The reason that hasn't been done is more about requirements and priorities and resources than it is about anything else. And that's about pulling things across that valley of death.
So now, obviously, we're getting to the heart of this conversation when we talk about resources. And I want to ask you about what you are advocating that we do less of so as to spend more to pull these key systems across the valley of death so that they're usable. You and General Brown wrote in a joint article this month that modernization means letting go of familiar systems and concepts. So I want to ask you to be specific. Like what? What is it that the Air Force and the other services, but let's focus on the Air Force, needs to let go of in your legacy package?
In terms of existing capability, there are a number of things. The venerable A-10, which is an Army officer I supported for many, many decades, actually, is not a system that we're going to need against the kinds of adversaries we're concerned about most now. We have older systems like AWACS and JSTARS, which were designed for a different era and are very hard to maintain. So we're trying to move some of those out of the inventory and replace them. And we started down that path by putting Wedgetail E-7 aircraft in as an AWACS replacement in our budget. We also need to move away from or to a total reliance on airborne systems for those capabilities to space-based capabilities, resilient space-based capabilities in that case. There are some systems that were required to prosecute the counterinsurgencies or the war on terror adversaries that we dealt with that still have utility, but that we acquired an awful lot of, and we're going to move some of that out of the Air Force over time as well. So there are things that are in existence that we need to replace with things that are more suited to our needs today. And there are also things in our pipeline that I talked about that, and General Brown and I are going to do this together, and so General Raymond. We're going to take a look at some of our prototyping things and say, okay, the question we need to ask is, even if this is successful, are we going to fund it and buy it? And if the answer is no, we should stop now. Now, that's a work in progress. We still have a little bit of work to do there. We can't afford to do everything that we need, and frankly, we need to repurpose dollars that are not focused on our driving adversaries, our pacing challenges, or as we call it, and get those dollars applied to those problems, because we have a lot of work to do there. And again, we don't have a moment to lose.
Parenthetical thought, why don't we give those A-10s to Ukraine?
General Brown addressed that question this morning about what fighters Ukraine might be interested in. That's largely up to Ukraine. I think as CQ pointed out, there are a number of international opportunities that are possible there. Older U.S. systems are a possibility. And so as Ukraine, who is pretty busy right now dealing with the right now problem, tries to sort out what its future will be longer term, we'll be open to discussions with them about what their requirements are and how we might be able to satisfy them. But there are a number of possibilities.
So coming back to this question of what we do less of, you've been pretty frank in addressing that. But I want to ask you the obvious question. To be blunt, will Congress let you do what you want to do?
Yeah, I'm encouraged by the response I've gotten from the Congress so far. I put together a threat briefing, which is fairly highly classified, and took it to all the committees that oversee the Department of the Air Force, as well as to others who are cleared and interested in that. And I think that's had an impact. Made a pretty impassioned plea last year to allow us to divest some of our older systems, something that's historically been difficult. And we succeeded with one exception in FY22. FY23, we have some additional divestitures we've asked for. And so far, there's been pretty broad support for that. So I'm encouraged by what's happening with the Congress so far. This isn't easy for them, okay? And as I was going through confirmation, and I understand the political interests that aren't there. As I was going through confirmation, every senator I talked to had a sentence for me, something like, I understand that you're concerned about China, and I think that's really important, but by the way, I've got these C-130s, or fill in the blank, in my state, and I really think that they're important. So there is an interest there that we have to come to grips with, and we will try to work with people on the political spectrum on both sides of the aisle to come up with solutions that are win-wins for all of us. But again, we have to move forward.
Let's talk about Taiwan. We just had an unusual exchange with the Chinese ambassador to Washington. I'll leave comments on that to others. But I'd like to ask you to put on an imaginary PLA uniform, if you will, and think with us about what the Chinese military leadership would think about Taiwan in light of what they've seen in Ukraine. What are the lessons for the Chinese in terms of the difficulty of that operation and the ways to succeed?
I've got that question any number of times. It's come up in the here at the forum a number of times. There are some lessons I think China should get from what's going on. One of them that I hope they get is that the economic consequences of an act of aggression are extreme, and that you should definitely try to avoid that at all costs. Now that's a lesson that isn't entirely complete yet, and we need to stick together to make sure that is a lesson that they get. Another at the senior political leadership for China is that all those things that my military is telling me about how great they are might not be as true as they would like them to be. I am sure that Mr. Putin was told how successful and how capable his military was, and that turned out not to be the case. So hopefully leadership at the senior level in China is being thoughtful about that. CQ mentioned some of the things about air superiority and the ability to, the importance in a conventional operation of taking control of the air. I guess the third thing that the Chinese leadership, I hope, will get from this is that your attempt to have a very quick win may not be successful, and you may find yourself bogged down in a long campaign that you really didn't anticipate and weren't prepared for. But again, back at the military side, air power matters, space power matters too, and there are things that are being done through the space domain that are very important to the conflict in Ukraine. The efficacy of mobile air defenses and man-portable air defenses against the Russian military should give people pause. The utility of precision munitions, which we're showing right now, I think should give people pause. And I think as people learn lessons from this, I'm hoping that the Taiwanese learn some lessons about what would be most effective in their defense and that they apply those lessons as well.
One of the points that came through for me in the Chinese ambassador's comments was his repeated discussion of avoiding miscalculations with the United States, talking with the United States, et cetera. The question of strategic stability talks with the Chinese, similar to the dialogue that we've had for decades with the Russians because of the arms control process, is something that administration officials have spoken about privately. And I'd like to ask you if you would address what your own view would be about the utility of strategic stability talks with China and what you think would be issues that ought to be on that agenda.
I'm not a policy person. I'm an organized, trained, equipped person like General Brown, General Raymond. But my Cold War experience is very illuminating to me here. We do need to have dialogue with China, much more so than we are having. General Milley, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, spoke with me very recently about a conversation he had with his counterpart. It was very candid. We need to have more of those, and we need to talk about stability in particular. The most concerning thing that I may have seen in my entire career is the recent revelation of the Chinese nuclear breakout, that they're going to bring their force up to something roughly comparable to the forces that the US and Russia have. We've never lived in a tripolar nuclear world before. I lived in the bipolar nuclear world for a long time, and I was very involved in the issues of strategy and deterrence associated with that. And we analyzed to death ladders in the escalation train and how one move by one or the other would affect each other. You started the conversation, I think, talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis. We do not want to be back in a situation that's that perilous for any of our countries. So we need to be talking to each other. One of the experiences I had in the Cold War was that the Soviets would say things that I didn't believe. I thought that there's no way they can actually believe this. They're just trying to, manipulate us some way. After the Cold War ended, I discovered that they actually did believe those things. And there was a cultural mismatch or gap between ourselves and the Soviets at the time that was more significant to our understanding of each other than I appreciated while I was a participant in that exercise. The cultural gap we have between ourselves and the Chinese is vast compared to the one that exists, I think, between ourselves and the Russians. We need to be talking. We need to be able to understand each other better. We need to understand each other's motivations and incentives and how we see each other. And we need to take positive steps to address instabilities. If the world ever gets into a nuclear exchange, I think it will be because of a severe miscalculation by one side or the other, perhaps by both sides. And we need to do everything that we possibly can to avoid that.
I want to ask you about one exotic military technology that gets a lot of attention, and that's hypersonics. You and I, in conversations that we've had, I've been struck by your skepticism that just because the Russians and Chinese are spending a lot of money on hypersonics, that doesn't mean that we should too. And maybe you could explain for this audience why you're skeptical about the utility of some of these systems for the United States.
I don't regard hypersonics as a truly revolutionary capability or as a panacea for our operational needs. I think I understand why China is pursuing them. They have a certain target set they're interested in, and hypersonics can be useful for that. We have a very different target set, so we don't have a symmetric situation in regard to China. We will pursue hypersonics. We will field hypersonics. They will be a part of our inventory. I don't regard them as a dramatic, or I don't see a big capability gap, I'll put it that way, that I'm concerned about between ourselves and others with regard to hypersonics. They have several features which are interesting. They're very fast, obviously, so they get where you intend them to go much more quickly. They're very hard to defend against. They follow unpredictable trajectories. It makes it harder to assess an attack and determine where it's going. You need different sensors, particularly for the very long-range systems, to track them during their flight and understand what the attack intends. But they're also very expensive, and they have somewhat limited capabilities in terms of the target set that they can address. So you have to look at them from a point of view of cost effectiveness based on your military needs, not somebody else's. And if that hadn't been the case, right, we would have invested much more aggressively in hypersonics much earlier than we did. We did do programs like the DARPA program, which had a couple of failures to try to move the technology forward because it was of interest. But I don't see it as a truly revolutionary capability like some other capabilities might be.
We have just a minute left, but I want to ask you one more hard question, and that takes us back to Ukraine and really where we began our conversation. As we all know, tactical nuclear weapons are part of Russia's military doctrine, and they keep dropping hints that they might use them. The United States, after the INF Treaty, basically gave up its tactical nukes. And I'm wondering, as you think about the future and the dangers that we now see so obviously, you think we're going to need to have tactical nuclear weapons of our own going forward because we have an adversary that clearly threatens to use them?
For a long time, Russia has had a doctrine of increased reliance on tactical nuclear weapons. I think they saw our conventional advantages as being overwhelming to their conventional forces, and therefore went down the path of fielding and putting into their doctrine greater reliance on tactical nuclear weapons, and that's where they sit today. So as we watch what's happening, or as we are involved in what's happening in Ukraine, we are very conscious of the fact that they have that capability. We don't see any clear evidence that they would be inclined to use it. It would be certainly not to their advantage to do that, but it's something that's a possibility. I am not involved in those kinds of discussions right now. We do have some tactical capabilities. We have dual-use capabilities with some of our allies in Europe. So they're a part of our suite of capabilities that we use for deterrence. I think it depends again on the course that our potential adversaries, in this case now particularly China, take with regard to their own modernization. You know, we've just seen public evidence that they're expanding their strategic nuclear force substantially. They have a lot of weapons which could carry both tactical and nuclear weapons, conventional and nuclear weapons at the tactical level as well. And so that's something we need to be watching, and again, something we need to be talking about with the Chinese. I spent a good part of my career avoiding working on nuclear weapons. I think they're inherently extraordinarily destructive and dangerous. I was thinking earlier that the only time that they've been used was by the United States, and they were used for the purpose of bringing an end to a devastating global conflict. And since that time, no one's crossed that threshold, and I think we should do everything we can to make sure that nobody ever does.
Air Force Secretary Frank Kendall, thank you very much.
We have now a session that hits squarely at the theme that's going to run through our 3 days together.